Today I thought we would talk about all the books I have read in Q1 of 2024. For some reason I had it in my head that the end of Q1 would be the end of April, but no, it's technically the end of March because it's every 3 months. I can't remember if I finished this in December or January, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Bookshops and Bonedust. Now, this is the prequel to Legends and Lattes. This is a cozy fantasy series with a lot of heart. This is about Viv before she settles down and opens a tea shop, so she is an adventurer in this one. Viv is hurt and taken to this small sea town village. I did like some elements more than Legends and Lattes. However, for me overall, I think I preferred Legends and Lattes. I think this one has a better antagonist. It's very straightforward. An antagonist is just this evil person doing evil because they're evil, and we don't get a whole lot of morally grayness or depth to the antagonist. However, I felt like the antagonist in Legends and Lattes was just kind of brushed aside and was this very intangible sort of concept, whereas in Bookshops and Bonedust, yes, it was very simple, an antagonist, but it was something you could imagine. It was something that was clear and obviously the antagonist of this story. So I thought that that was definitely an upgrade from Legends and Lattes. However, I just wanted more from Bookshops and Bonedust. I felt like there was so much going on with so many side characters and sort of side plot lines, and none of them really were expanded enough for me personally. It's a very short book. It's probably only about 300 pages. Yeah, 350 pages, and it wasn't enough to flesh out any part of the story that I would have liked it to have been. And I know that's not the point of the story. It's meant to be short and sweet, and it is short and sweet. I just wanted a little bit more from it. That being said, what we did get, I really enjoyed. I loved meeting Satchel and Pot Roast, and they're building up this bookshop as a business, and sort of Viv getting on with some of these characters in the village, and then this underarching promise of this antagonist getting closer and closer. All the fun, cozy vibes, and Travis Baldree does not get enough credit for his prose. Some of the description work in this is just so well done. Usually is very straightforward, but occasionally has this more thorough passage where he's really getting more flowery with his language just for setting description usually, and it is so well done. I would love to see more writing from him like that, because I think it's excellent. And as a short, cozy fantasy, this hit the nail on the head. So if you're looking for something a wee bit different, perhaps between longer fantasy series, definitely check out Bookshops and Bonedust and Legends and Lattes. And I would highly recommend the audiobooks. It is narrated by Travis Baldree himself, and he's an amazing audiobook narrator. Next on up, we have the first book club pick for the month of January, which was The Bloodstones by Tori Tekken. This book opens with 3 young boys who watch an execution. So immediately, I knew I was going to like this book, and it was going to be a pretty dark book. The setting's really cool. It's kind of this mix between ancient Japan and sort of ancient, like Mongolian sort of influences. I also got pieces of Nordic and Norse Viking sort of history as well melded in, and it was a really cool setting and a really cool world building. The magic system is left very open even at the end of the first book. However, it has a lot of promise and intrigue, and I'm all for one that you don't need to be info dumped the entire magic system in the first book. I quite like this sort of just teasing of this is kind of where we're going with this, and you can kind of make some guesses and some predictions about where it's going without being just throwing the whole hard magic system right from page 1. I did find that some parts of the story did wane a little with the pacing, and I was just ready to kind of move on and get to the next part. And I do think that this first book is very much an opening to this series. It has a fantastic ending, but I would have liked some more in the story, which is a good problem to have. It's just, it was so good, I kind of wanted more from it. So I can't really complain, but I did want more of the overarching story from this first book, because I feel like we've seen the tip of the iceberg that's going to be this series. This is a multi-POV, and I do think that each part is developed very well. We get Sindri, who's awesome. She's such a cool character, who's part of this sort of more Mongolian side of the culture, or at least Mongolian influenced side of the culture, where we have these warring clans that fight against each other in these wildlands. And that part of the story was really, really cool. I always loved a Sindri chapter. She's completely chaotic and very violent and set in her ways. And seeing this plotline with the clans and looking at it on a map compared to everything else that was going on, you could see how eventually this is all going to come together. And it has me so excited to read on. I also really liked the main character, Garen, who is this young boy. He's the one that witnessed, or one of the ones that witnessed, the execution at the start of the book. And what he gets wrapped into, I don't really know. Does the inciting incident count as a spoiler? Because it's right at the start of the book, but at the same time, I don't want to ruin it. He gets wrapped up in some crazy stuff and gets sort of trained up to become this sort of assassin. And he's with this group of people. And I do like the found family elements that he has with some of the people that he then grows up with. There's so much to this story. A lot of it is political machinations behind the scenes. You can see how all the different pieces are moving on the map. So I'm very excited to continue this one. And the ending was really cool. I don't want to say much about it, but it was really cool. Tori, I need you to hurry up and write the next one, please. Next on up, of course, I also caught up with Dungeon Crawler Carl. I have listened to book 5 and 6 on audiobook, and this series continues to be amazing. In fact, I do think that these are probably the 2 best books in this series. They're so good. I've talked about the series a lot. If you've not read it now, I don't know how more to convince you to read it. It's so good. I am so impressed with how Matt manages to include new elements to the story that just keep it fresh and interesting with every book. Now, of course, this is a dungeon crawling fantasy, which means you do have the quirk of the floor as they make their way further down in the dungeon. Each floor is completely different, and I do think that the floor mechanics are something that's a really good way to keep it very fresh. However, on top of that, he adds in just parts of the story that are more connected to the overarching narrative of the series. This whole idea of the Borant Corporation who run the dungeon, and sort of all the political stuff that's going on behind the scenes with the TV show. Just everything that goes on with all that and how it progresses with every book. And there's new things that get added on and new things that are just complete chaos. Especially in book 6, there's one part of the story to do with the AI, and it's so much fun. It's such a cool idea and just opens the series to so many possibilities. But I will say also the floor mechanics are really cool. I think the sort of setup for the floor in book 6 is probably the most interesting of all. As soon as we're getting introduced to it, it's a very slow start to the book, but once you get into it and see how this works, it's a ton of fun. And I am sad that these mechanics do stay on the floors, because some of them I do wish would continue on. The way that Matt leaves scars, the way that he then makes these things make a difference in the long term, even if they don't last forever. Particularly with book 6, some things that happen that's going to affect later floors. Very cool, very exciting. I need the next book yesterday. And it continues to be hilarious and wacky and bizarre, but also it continues to get darker and darker in tone. The way that this series has really just got this complete juxtaposition between the very funny and humorous and bizarre elements and this story that's just so could also be a grimdark story, in the way that they fuse so well together. Read Dungeon Crawler Carl and listen to the audiobooks. The audiobooks, best way to consume this story. Next on up, we have This Is How You Lose the Time War. Now, this is a really weird book. This was the Discord read-along for the month of February, and it is a fantasy novella, so it's fairly short. I think it's only about 200 pages long, and I don't know how I feel about this. A lot of people say it is a masterpiece, And I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to feel about this one, because I can see what the author was doing, but I just don't think it was a book for me personally. But also I can respect and stand back and look at the craft of making this, and it's so well done. But this is a dual POV fantasy sci-fi novella thing where two characters are sort of leaving letters for one another, and they are on opposite sides of a war. Now, this war is through time. So what's really cool is some of the world building aspects of that isn't particularly delved into in detail. However, you do kind of pick up this idea that we have this conflicting sides, and I don't really want to go too much in detail on who they are and what they do, but they do have this sort of butterfly effect to then sort of battle each other. So the characters, these agents that we follow, do small little details in parts of time and live these lives to then affect the future and have this butterfly effect that affects the entire timeline that they are on. Which is such a cool idea. This butterfly effect war. That's awesome. That's so cool. And sort of the dynamic between these two characters and how they go back and forth with leaving letters for each other in these really unique ways is so cool. And some of the themes and ideas that are delved into are really, really interesting. And again, I don't want to go too much in detail in case you do want to read this. But for me, the execution is what makes this such a Marmite book. The prose is incredibly purple. It's very, very flowery and very not difficult to follow, but meandering in the sense that there's a lot of sentences that if you're one that likes to really analyze sentences and exactly what the author is trying to say through metaphors and particular word choice and imagery, then this is definitely one for you. There is so much to delve in here, and I'm sure a lot of it went over my head with the first read through, but it just felt like a chore to read sometimes because it was so dense and difficult to follow that I had to really concentrate on what was going on, which is fine. I'm all for deep prose and concepts. It felt like just too much of a stretch for me personally. Maybe I'm too dumb. It's distinctly possible. I think conceptually this is really, really well done. In execution, that's what I didn't particularly enjoy about it. I think some people will love it because of the execution, and that's what makes this such a unique book. Personally, I would love to see this story developed in a more standardized way, where we get to actually see more day-to-day life with the character. I want to know more about their past, and I want to know more about the individuals, the two characters that we follow. I feel like this was very, in some ways, surface level with the two main characters, because we do just sort of get what they're doing in snippets and not enough of their overarching life. And we do get bits of it, but it just wasn't enough for me personally. And I definitely understand that is the point of this story. The elements that I perhaps didn't like that much is the point. So I can't really criticize it, because I also think it is really, really well done. And anyone who tries a very unique and interesting structure and setup immediately gets brownie points from me, because I just think it's a ton of fun and an interesting way to create this new type of story, but it just didn't necessarily work for me personally. Is this a masterpiece? Maybe. I might go back to it one day. I kind of want to go back and see what I think of it on a reread, but it's definitely an interesting story. Next one up, I kind of went a bit on a fantasy novella binge from that, and I thought it'd be really cool to read some more novellas. I did do an entire video talking about the three I'm about to talk about in more detail, but just a very quick whistle-stop tour. First of all, I read In the Shadow of Their Dying by Michael R. Fletcher and Anna Smith Spark. Now, this is a dark, dark book. If you like grimdark, this is definitely one to check out, because, oh boy, this might be one of the darkest books I have read. But we follow a couple of different point of view characters. However, the main one is this third best assassin. And in this city, they are currently under siege. And the main assassin is hired to then kill the king. This story is the equivalent of being thrown in a minecart, having the brakes cut, and then being tossed into this railway track from hell in the depths of this dark mountain mine. It's chaos. One of the other points of view is a demon, and it's incredibly well written. A lot of demons in fantasy are just sort of very humanized, and they're just sort of creatures of this other realm that's very similar to reality and our normal realm. However, in this case, you can tell it's completely foreign and doesn't understand humans at all. And that very unique perspective and dynamic in the story is such a cool thing to be in the perspective of when you're reading, and getting those chapters is horrifying, but it's really, really interesting. And I think this very chaotic, bizarre story is pulled together so well in the finale. Everything just kind of comes to head in this mangle of pure chaos that just is a fantastic ending to a bizarre story. Next on up, I read The Krakens Tooth, the second fantasy novella in Anthony Ryan's Seven Swords series. Now, this is a series of fantasy novellas, the first being The Pilgrimage of Swords. Just going to start off with my complaint with this novella is it's very straightforward and very similar to the first one. If you've read A Pilgrimage of Swords and you jump immediately into Krakens Tooth, it does feel very repetitive. I read A Pilgrimage of Swords at the end of last year. This still felt very, very similar in structure. The whole series is based on these 7 demon swords and how Pilgrim is trying to collect them all. And it very much just feels like we find an ancient place, we get roped into some local disputes, and then we go on this mini quest to find the sword, going through these ancient places, and sort of everything comes to clash together at the end. And that's exactly what happens in the first 2 novellas. However, what I loved about the first one and also the sequel is it does everything I love about fantasy. Magic items, interesting characters, ancient lost histories. It does everything I love about fantasy in a little bite-sized novella. So it's a lot of fun to fit in between other books that I've been reading, especially if I just want a sort of classic fantasy fix. And I also loved learning more about Pilgrim and his past in this second novella, and kind of building on him as a person. And even the local story was interesting, and the other characters that I don't want to spoil the first novella too, is a blast. It's just very similar. I'm kind of hoping the third novella does stray from this structure and do something a little bit different, but otherwise it was still a ton of fun. And the last fantasy novella I read in the first quarter of the year is War Song by Michael Mitchell, which is another grimdark fantasy novella. This is a fantastic character piece, really delving deep into the character of Admar, who is this individual who is kind of beaten down by this world as they are under occupation from this foreign army. It's a prequel novella to The Price of Power, and I do think it does a fantastic job of kind of setting up the tone and the world. I've not read The Price of Power yet, but I get a good feel for how it's going to be after reading this, and this sort of narrow focus on this individual character, but also the way that it shows this wider sphere of the world building and the setting and how this country is under occupation from these horrific people who have this bizarre magic system that isn't completely explained in the novella, but it does a fantastic job as this prequel novella, an introduction to the world, and has me very excited to pick up The Price of Power. The pacing was fantastic, the writing was super smooth and easy to read, but also really, really well done and beautifully written. I honestly don't have a whole lot of complaints about this. I had an absolute blast with this novella, and I cannot wait to continue to the full book. And you can get it completely for free by signing up to Michael Mitchell's newsletter. The ebook, obviously the physical has printing costs. And last but most certainly not least, the book club pick for March. That's very difficult to say. The book club pick for March was Furies of Calederon by Jim Butcher. Now, technically, I did finish this in April, but because it was the March pick, I'm going to talk about in this video where to begin with this book. Okay, first of all, the magic system. Let's start there because it is so cool. For those who don't know, this story has a really interesting sort of origin where Jim Butcher, before he was published, was in these writing forums and he was arguing with someone about being able to create a story from any premise. It's all about the execution of the story itself. And he was arguing for that. So to prove his point, he said, okay, give me 2 concepts and I will write a fantasy novella using those. And the prompts were the Roman Empire and Pokemon. that's where we got this. It isn't completely explained in this first book. However, there are these Furies, and they are creatures who live in different elements. So we have water Furies and fire Furies, and they can bond to individuals, and then the individuals can then call on them and sort of use the element as magic. So it's kind of a bit like Avatar: The Last Airbender meets Spren from Stormlight Archive is sort of a good way of picturing it. However, they also have these other abilities too tied to their Furies. For example, the Water Furies can help feel other people's emotions. If one is bonded to a Water Fury, they can feel how other individuals around them are feeling and sort of take on some of those emotions, which isn't necessarily a good thing. This started with one of them really struggling to manage the anxiety because she was picking it up from others who were living in the same house as her. So it has interesting limitations as well as powers. Also, this is a fairly chunky book. This is the mass market paperback, but it's about 600 pages long, and it flies. This is such a fast-paced, action-packed novel that is just a ton of fun to read. I will say for the most part the characters are well done in this first book. My only complaint is because there is so much going on and because it is so fast-paced, I feel like we didn't really delve very deeply into any of the characters as individuals. There's just so many points of view and side characters. We have 3 antagonists, we have 4 or 5 main characters, and then we have pretty big important side characters on top of those. There was just a lot of people introduced in this, which was fine, and they were all very easy to distinguish because they were very individualized. However, I just felt like we never delved particularly deeply into one, and I never really connected with any of the characters on a deep level. Now, I did enjoy this story. I had a really fun time with it. Fast read, interesting characters, interesting world building. Not a lot of depth or connection to the characters, but I'm hoping we'll get that in future books. The one thing that really bothered me with this book is the really weird sexual undertones to every single aspect of this story. Now, I don't mind these topics being discussed, and I don't mind the inclusion of these sort of more sexual elements, but it was just in every single part of the story. Like I was saying earlier, this does kind of break off into several different narrative threads, and every single one had this weird sexual undertone, and I don't understand why it was everywhere in this story. If it was in 1 or 2 of the threads, I'd be like, okay, fine. But it was in every single one. There was something, and it was just weird. And it didn't bring anything to the narrative in most of the threads. I'm like, why are we doing this everywhere? And it started to grate on me throughout the story. And what's weird is the tone of this book is quite youthful. I think this would be a fantastic entry into adult fantasy. I think you could almost get away with it being sort of an older YA, apart from this weird sexual undertone to everything. I would have loved to recommend this to sort of beginner fantasy readers, but I don't want to now. I do feel like it brought the story down for me personally. I have heard that it lessens as the series goes on, so I'll definitely be continuing it, but it was weird. I don't get it. Why was it there? I will say the conclusion and finale to this book was really good, and it's doing a pretty good job of setting up the series, so I will continue it, but it was weird. But that is all the books that I have read in the first 3 months of the year. My favourite so far has definitely been Dungeon Crawler Carl. Probably no surprise to anyone. But let me know in the comments below, what is your favourite read of the year so far? And thank you very much for watching. Outro. This is going to be a weird thumbnail because I read a lot of these with audio. I'm going to have to find some other books to just kind of fill in the spots for the others.